Remember when buying a motorcycle in the 2000s felt like playing Russian roulette with wheels? Here's the statistics no one talks about. Motorcycles are over 29 times more deadly than cars. We're talking about 212 deaths per billion passenger miles. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into motorcycle history, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more to explore. And today, we're counting down 15 bikes from that era that were notorious for sending people to the hospital or worse. Those were the days when manufacturers seemed to think safety features meant making sure the bike had brakes, sometimes. The decade gave us bikes that were drop-dead gorgeous, emphasis on the dead part. Number 15. Suzuki Hayabusa, Generation 1. The Hayabusa wasn't just fast. It was the kind of fast that made people wearing suits nervous. When Suzuki released this thing in '99, they built a bike that could do 194 miles per hour. Then, in 2000, manufacturers all agreed to limit bikes to 186 miles per hour. Guess which bike caused that conversation? The real problem was what it didn't have. 1,298 cubic centimeters and 175 horsepower with absolutely no electronic help. No traction control, no wheelie control, nothing. Just you, the throttle, and whatever prayers you remembered from childhood. The front wheel had a habit of leaving the ground without asking permission first. Several countries took one look at crash statistics and said, nope, straight up banned the thing. Even riders with decades of experience would get humbled by this bike. It had this charming tendency to go from, I got this, to oh no, in about half a second. Coming in at number 14, Suzuki GSX-R1000. You know that friend who seems calm until they've had 3 drinks and suddenly they're starting fights with everyone? That's the GSX-R1000. For the first few thousand RPM, this bike would purr like a kitten. But once you hit the power band, it transformed into a twitchy, unpredictable monster that could send you flying faster than you could blink. The K1 through K6 models were notorious for what riders called high-side crashes. You'd be leaning into a corner, feeling confident, when the 988 cubic centimeter engine would suddenly dump all 165 horses at once. The rear wheel would snap sideways, catch grip, and launch you over the handlebars like a human cannonball. The handling was so aggressive that even track riders struggled to keep these things pointed in the right direction. What made it worse was the complete lack of electronic aids. No traction control, no stability management, nothing to save you when the bike decided to get violent. The Delta Box frame was solid, but the suspension couldn't cope with the sudden power delivery. Riders would hit the throttle expecting smooth acceleration and instead get a mechanical bull that was actively trying to throw them off. At number 13, Ducati 999. Here's a bike that looked like Italian art, but rode like Italian chaos. The 999 had this gorgeous design that made every other motorcycle look boring. But Ducati engineers apparently forgot that motorcycles need to, actually work properly when you're trying not to crash. The biggest problem was literally right under your chest. The fuel tank was positioned so that when you leaned into corners, that thing you do on motorcycles, it would scrape against the frame. Not just a little scrape, but enough to actually destabilize the entire bike mid-corner. Imagine trying to take a tight turn and suddenly your bike starts wobbling because the tank is fighting with the frame. That's not exactly confidence-inspiring when you're doing 60 miles per hour with your knee inches from the asphalt. Then there were those desmodromic valves that Ducati loved bragging about. Sure, they sounded fancy, but under stress, they had a tendency to fail spectacularly. We're talking about internal engine components giving up right when you needed the bike to respond. The 998 cubic centimeter V-twin made decent power at 150 horses, but good luck trusting it when the engineering seemed more focused on looking pretty than keeping you alive. Number 12 on our list, Yamaha YZF-R1. The R1 was Yamaha's attempt at building the perfect sport bike. They almost succeeded, except for one tiny detail. The frame had a tendency to turn into jello at high speeds. The Delta box frame looked solid on paper, but when you pushed this 998 cubic centimeter beast past its comfort zone, things got sketchy fast. Here's what would happen. You're cruising along at highway speeds, feeling like the king of the road, when suddenly the handlebars would start doing this violent shaking dance called a tank slapper. The frame would flex just enough to let the front wheel wobble, and once that started, you were basically along for the ride. The 150 horsepower engine was more than happy to keep accelerating while the chassis was having a breakdown. The worst part was how unpredictable it was. Some riders never had issues, while others couldn't get through a track day without the bike trying to shake them off. It was like playing mechanical Russian roulette every time you twisted the throttle in the higher gears. The bike worked fine until it didn't, and when it didn't, you better hope you had your affairs in order. At number 11, Kawasaki ZX-12R Ninja. Kawasaki looked at the Hayabusa and thought, hold my beer. The ZX-12R was their answer to Suzuki's Speed Demon, packing 1,199 cubic centimeters and 178 horsepower into a package that could hit 190 miles per hour. The problem was, they forgot that motorcycles occasionally need to do things other than go really, really fast. The ram air system was supposed to be this cool feature that made the bike even faster at high speeds. What it actually did was create so much front-end lift that the bike wanted to become a very expensive, very dangerous airplane. Riders would hit the throttle hard and suddenly find themselves staring at clouds instead of the road ahead. Once you were airborne, steering became more of a suggestion than an actual function. Then there were the brakes, which were apparently designed by someone who had never heard of physics. You had all this speed and weight, but the stopping power of a bicycle. Emergency braking situations turned into emergency prayer situations real quick. The bike was fast enough to get you into trouble, but not quite equipped to get you out of it. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was really, really sharp, but you forgot to bring a shield. Number 10, BMW S1000RR. Leave it to the Germans to build a bike that was both incredibly sophisticated and incredibly dangerous at the same time. The S1000RR showed up in 2009 with 193 horsepower and a 0 to 60 time of 2.6 seconds. On paper, it looked like the perfect superbike. In reality, it was a masterclass in how not to introduce new technology. The early traction control system was about as reliable as a weather forecast. It would randomly decide to either not work at all or kick in at the worst possible moment. You'd be mid-corner, leaning the bike over, when the system would suddenly think you were losing traction and cut power. Nothing quite like having your bike's computer disagree with your riding mid-turn. But the real fun started when you tried to accelerate hard from a stop. That 999 cubic centimeter engine would dump all its power at once. The rear wheel would break loose, and if you weren't ready for it, you'd find yourself doing an unplanned wheelie. The bike had all this fancy German engineering, but apparently nobody tested it on actual humans who might make mistakes. It was like giving a loaded weapon to someone who just finished reading the instruction manual. Next up at number 9, Aprilia RSV1000. Aprilia decided to build a bike that was basically a street-legal race bike. Which sounds great until you realize that race bikes are meant to be ridden by people who know what they're doing. The RSV1000 packed a 998 cubic centimeter V-twin, making 153 horsepower into a 445-pound package. On paper, that power-to-weight ratio looked fantastic. In reality, it was a recipe for disaster. The engine had what engineers politely called a peaky power band. What that actually meant was that the bike would be completely docile one second, then try to launch you into orbit the next. There was no smooth transition between manageable and hold on for dear life. It was like having an on-off switch instead of a throttle. But the real killer was the suspension setup. When you hit the brakes, the front end would dive so dramatically that the front wheel would lose grip and slide out from under you. This was especially fun in wet conditions, where fun means absolutely terrifying. Riders would approach a corner, hit the brakes like they would on any normal motorcycle, and suddenly find themselves sliding sideways toward whatever solid object happened to be nearby. The bike looked gorgeous and sounded amazing, but it had the road manners of an angry bull. At number 8, we have Honda CBR 1000RR Fireblade. Honda has always been known for building reliable, predictable motorcycles. The Fireblade was their attempt to prove that they could build something completely insane too. This 998 cubic centimeter monster pumped out 172 horsepower, which would have been fine if Honda had bothered to include any electronic help. But they didn't. The throttle response was so aggressive that riders called it digital, meaning it went from 0 to good luck, with barely any warning. You'd be coming out of a corner, roll on the throttle like you would on any normal bike, and suddenly the rear wheel would break loose and slide sideways. The bike would go from perfectly composed to completely out of control in the time it takes to blink. What made it worse was that ABS was optional, and most people didn't bother getting it. So you had a bike that was eager to slide the rear wheel under acceleration and happy to lock up the front wheel under braking. It was like Honda engineers sat down and asked themselves, how can we make riding as unpredictable as possible? The bike was fast, sure, but it required constant attention because it was always looking for new ways to surprise you. Number 7 on the list, Triumph Daytona 675. Triumph looked at all the Japanese superbikes with their 4-cylinder engines and decided to be different. They built a 675 cubic centimeter triple that screamed all the way up to 13,000 RPM and made 123 horsepower. The engine was brilliant. The problem was everything else. The chassis simply couldn't handle what the engine was dishing out. That triple motor would rev so high and make so much power that it overwhelmed the suspension and frame. You'd be carving through corners, thinking you had everything under control, when the bike would suddenly develop a mind of its own and start pushing wide in turns. It was like the front and rear ends of the motorcycle belonged to two different bikes. The suspension mismatch made things even worse. The engineers apparently tuned the front and rear independently and forgot to check if they actually worked together. In tight turns, the bike would oversteer like a go-kart, which sounds fun until you're doing it at 60 miles per hour on public roads. The engine was begging you to ride hard, but the chassis was constantly trying to remind you that maybe you should slow down. It was a constant battle between what the bike wanted to do and what it was actually capable of doing safely. At number 6, MV Agusta F4 1000. Leave it to the Italians to build a motorcycle that looked like rolling artwork and rode like a beautiful disaster. The F4 1000 was MV Agusta's flagship superbike, packing a 998 cubic centimeter inline-4 engine that made 170 horsepower. It was gorgeous, it sounded incredible, and it had more character flaws than a soap opera villain. The frame had this annoying habit of flexing at high speeds, which turns out to be a pretty important thing for a motorcycle frame not to do. You'd be cruising along at highway speeds when the whole bike would start vibrating like it was coming apart. And sometimes, it actually was. MV Agusta had apparently decided that reliability was optional, so components would just randomly give up when you needed them most. But here's the really fun part. The electrical system was about as dependable as a chocolate teapot. You'd be riding along, everything working fine, when suddenly the bike would just lose power or the engine would cut out completely. Nothing quite like having your motorcycle decide to take a nap while you're doing 70 miles per hour in traffic. The bike was fast when it worked, but when it worked was the key phrase there. It was like owning a supermodel who occasionally tried to kill you. Coming in at number 5, Harley-Davidson VRSC V-Rod. Harley-Davidson looked at all these crazy, fast sport bikes and thought, we can build something dangerous too. So they created the V-Rod, which was their attempt at combining American styling with actual performance. The result was a 1,250 cubic centimeter V-twin making 122 horsepower wrapped in a package that looked cool but had some serious design issues. The biggest problem was the lean angle, or more accurately, the complete lack of lean angle. This thing had about 31 degrees of lean before parts of the bike started scraping the ground. For perspective, that's pathetic even by cruiser standards. You'd go into a corner at a perfectly reasonable speed, lean the bike over like you would any other motorcycle, and suddenly you'd hear grinding sounds as the foot pegs kissed the asphalt. But it gets worse. When those parts started scraping, they could actually lift the rear wheel off the ground. So not only were you grinding expensive bits of your motorcycle away, you were also losing rear wheel traction in the middle of a turn. It was like Harley engineers designed the bike and then forgot that corners exist. The V-Rod was fast in a straight line, but the moment the road started curving, it turned into a very expensive, very loud liability. Number 4 on our list, Yamaha YZF-R6. The R6 was Yamaha's entry into the middleweight supersport category, and boy did they commit to making it as unforgiving as possible. 599 cubic centimeters making 120 horsepower in a 410-pound package sounds reasonable until you realize that Yamaha apparently forgot to install proper suspension. The suspension was what engineers call underdamped, which is a polite way of saying it bounced around like a pogo stick on caffeine. You'd hit a bump in the road, and the bike would start oscillating up and down, side to side, basically in every direction except the one you wanted to go. It was like riding a mechanical bull that someone had taught to go really fast. What made it worse was that this bike became the poster child for stunt riding. Every wannabe stunt rider bought one, which meant the crash statistics went through the roof. The bike was already unstable, and then people started trying to do wheelies and stoppies on it. It was like giving a loaded gun to someone who just learned how to point it. The R6 looked fast, sounded fast, and was definitely fast, but it required skills that most riders simply didn't have to keep it pointed in the right direction. Taking the third spot, Kawasaki ZX-10R. Kawasaki engineers apparently looked at smooth, predictable power delivery and decided that was for wimps. The ZX-10R packed 998 cubic centimeters and 175 horsepower into a package that delivered power like a broken fire hose. Either nothing or way too much with no middle ground. The engine would cruise along peacefully until you hit 11,000 RPM, and then it would suddenly dump every single horsepower at once. You'd be accelerating normally, thinking everything was under control, when the bike would lurch forward like it got kicked by an invisible giant. This wasn't gradual power delivery. This was mechanical whiplash. Riders would get caught off guard by the sudden surge and find themselves going much faster than they intended, much sooner than they expected. But here's the really dumb part. Kawasaki decided to put a fancy digital dashboard on this thing that was impossible to read at speed. So you had a bike that would suddenly surge forward without warning, and you couldn't even tell how fast you were going while it was happening. It was like playing a video game where someone randomly hits the fast forward button and then turns off the speedometer. The combination of unpredictable power and useless instrumentation made this bike a masterclass in poor decision-making. Number 2. Ducati 1098. Ducati took everything they learned about building fast motorcycles and then made it as uncomfortable and unpredictable as possible. The 1098 featured an 1099 cubic centimeter V-twin making 160 horsepower, which was plenty of power to get you in trouble. The problem was the chassis, which Ducati built so stiff that it would bite you in corners like an angry snake. Most motorcycle frames have a little bit of flex to help absorb bumps and provide feedback to the rider. Ducati decided that was for weaklings and built a frame so rigid that it would transmit every vibration, every imperfection in the road, straight to the handlebars. Hit a bump mid-corner and the bike would buck and kick like you'd just asked it to do something unreasonable, like go around a turn smoothly. Then there was the single-sided swing arm, which looked incredibly cool but created what engineers call torque reaction. What that meant in real-world terms was that when you accelerated hard, the bike would try to flip over backwards. The engine would twist one way, the swing arm would react the other way, and you'd be along for the ride as the front wheel headed toward the sky. It was like riding a mechanical seesaw that someone had attached a rocket engine to. Beautiful to look at, terrifying to ride. Here we are at number 1. KTM RC8 a bike that most people have never heard of. The KTM RC8 was Austria's attempt at building a superbike, and they succeeded in creating something that was fast, gorgeous, and absolutely lethal. 1195 cubic centimeters of V-twin Fury, making 152 horsepower, with all the modern safety features of a 1970s dirt bike. The throttle was completely raw. No fly-by-wire, no electronic assistance, nothing between your wrist and 1100 cubic centimeters of angry Austrian engineering. Twist that throttle and the bike would respond instantly, violently, and with zero forgiveness for mistakes. It was like having a direct neural connection to the engine, except the engine was trying to kill you. The real fun started in the low gears, where the engine would lug and surge unpredictably. You'd be putting along at low RPM when the engine would suddenly catch up with itself and launch you forward. This would cause what riders call high sides, where the rear wheel slides out, catches grip, and launches you over the handlebars faster than you can say health insurance. The RC8 was KTM's love letter to pure, unfiltered motorcycle performance, and it was about as safe as juggling chainsaws while blindfolded. It was the kind of bike that made even experienced riders nervous, which is exactly why it earns the top spot on our list. The 2000s were truly the Wild West of motorcycle manufacturing, when engineers prioritized power over pretty much everything else, including your ability to stay on the bike. 15 motorcycles that turned riding into an extreme sport whether you wanted it to be or not. These bikes completely ignored the concept of rider survival. Looking back, it's amazing that anyone survived test riding these things, let alone buying them for daily use. Which one of these death traps would you be brave enough to ride, or do you have a horror story about one of these bikes? Drop a comment below and let us know. Remember folks, the only thing more dangerous than these motorcycles was the overconfidence of the people who bought them.